Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I have another synth sound to break down. I was recently working on some different wavetables and from there spawned a little bit of an experiment on my behalf and I got out a very cool and very interesting result. So the synth that I have is this one right here. As you can hear, it sounds very electronic and I would definitely see this in some kind of high-tech, mainly kind of like a darker high-tech production. It has that very cool, very digital vibe to me, and part of that comes from the way that we're using the quantize here, which you can see we're currently not using specifically. We're using the wavetable position, but the wavetable position is also a version of the quantization. The only reason why I use the wavetable position in this case is because then within the wavetable I can select exactly which frames that I want. Instead of having to very precisely set modulation, low point and high point, what I can do is I can just delete all of the oscillations that don't work for this particular sound. Now the way that this sound started was actually with some kind of designer FM. As you can see, we have a very specific shape in here. This is actually half a saw wave, just the top half of a saw wave, if we disregard the quantization itself. And what happened then is I was FMing, as you can see here, this B oscillator, and I was trying out some different basic shapes here. I landed on this one and I was using my usual approach to designer FM, which is to go into the remap and play around with the remap shape. And I stumbled upon this shape here, which to me looked like a quantization shape. As you can see, it looks like it's quantized, the same way that it's quantized. The cool thing about quantize itself though is that you can kind of glide through kind of like the different sizes of it. So going back to quantize, you can see, especially in this higher part, that you're just kind of morphing through different sizes of like the cells that it used to quantize things. Now I wanted to make use of that, and the way that you can do that is by just here and then render oscillator A warp. That will take whatever is happening on the warp and apply that to the current cycle of your wavetable position. So in this case it would be our normal saw. Let's actually go over that again. We had the normal saw. The way that you create this is by actually going down to 1 here and then 2 here and then clicking on the top half. You can see now we get a nice half saw kind of thing. It is actually a normal saw wave but with a slight DC offset. If you were to imagine this at the center of the wave, then it would obviously be a normal saw, but this one is kind of skewed to the top level instead of the bottom level, which is actually very useful for FM applications. If you ever struggle to understand FM, one of the things that you can try is to just stay in the positive values, because then the FM is just going to do one-way modulation instead of the both ways that it normally would. So from there, obviously we want to apply our quantization to this specific wavetable here. So we go in here and then render the warp. Now we can go in here and we can check the waves. If we go through them, you can see they become gradually more quantized. I don't want these last few ones here, so I'm probably going to select one right about here and remove select until the end. And then at the start I want to go into around 50, I think the original value was, and then go beginning to select it. And that's kind of the range that we start with. You can see that you can already start to see kind of the jagged edges starting to appear. And the more obviously you go towards the back here, the more that you can see them. Here they become clearly visible. And here you can even make out individual like steps that it uses. And the more you go higher, the bigger those steps become. So as you can see, with the new wavetable that we just recreated, we're back at the same spot that we were. So in essence, the sound is just these two oscillators, one being FM by the other. This is the basic MIDI without any modifications here. That just goes through the bandpass filter here on number B. And obviously, both the wavetable position and the filter cutoff in this case are randomly modulated. If you go in here, you can see that we're using both the wavetable position and the random modulation. One thing I'll talk about is this B octave in a little bit. And finally, one thing to quickly note is that there is this envelope set up to just create the shape here that we want for our sound. The next thing that I want to talk about, which is interesting as well, is the use of the zero square distortion here. Now the zero square distortion is a very specific kind of distortion in that it doesn't distort the loudest parts of the sound, it distorts the quietest part of the sound. You can see that in the curve as well. You can see that the curve is mainly here below where it's adding extra energy. It's adding a little bit on the top as well to round it off, but obviously the most energy is added here. For those that don't know how a distortion curve works, I am probably going to do a full tutorial on distortion at some point, but I quickly just want to explain. Here you can see the distortion curve. This is set to asymmetric mode, which is the same mode that it shows up in here. This is asymmetric mode. The way that these modes work is that the zero line is at the middle and in the middle here as well, and it just remaps volumes instantly. So what it will do, if you want a distortion in this case, something that distorts the sound, we obviously want to make it louder. So a distortion curve might look something like this, where for low values, for example 20, it's going to be remapped to 40, which is an increase in volume. And the way that this distortion curve is created and shaped obviously tells us a lot about the type of distortion that we're going to get. Specifically for zero cross distortion, what you'll find is that there's a very large jump near the 0 point, hence the name. So this curve would look something like this, with a very quick jump between volumes here. What you do want to keep in mind though is that in the exact middle, where it is 0, you generally want to go to 0 either way. So you want the jump to be around and not exactly on the 0 point. Obviously you don't want it when it's silent to still output something, because that's what it will do. If you map the 0 all the way to the top, it will start to output if there is nothing going through here. You can see I have stopped playing it, but it's still outputting a fake signal because it's still keeping that at the point where it's defined right here, even though the input volume is 0. So going back to the sound, what this zero square does for the sound itself is that it basically adds high end everywhere. If I turn it off, you can hear that it doesn't really sound that great. It really lacks that nice crispy high end. So adding this back in just gives us that grit that hopefully makes it stand out in the mix as well. Now one of the things to keep in mind is because zero square works on the very lower volumes of the sound, what will happen when the volume kind of decays with, for example, this release timing here, is that the distortion will become more intense towards the quieter parts of the sound. Now obviously we don't really want this because it sounds unnatural. So what I've done is I've just set the envelope to the mix here, which actually fixes that. Without it you can hear that the distortion just becomes too much in the release sections, in the parts where the sound itself isn't really that loud. This just makes the sound a little bit more staccato and in my opinion a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more alive. The final thing that I want to talk about is this trick that I've been doing for quite a while now with some of my synths. It doesn't work on all of them, but for this one it worked quite well, and that is just to randomly change the octave of the sound. Here you can see we have this random modulator that we're also using for the wavetable, and that's just changing the octave. I can set this to 0 to have you listen to what it sounds like without. That sounds kind of boring, kind of normal. We kind of already have heard these types of sound before. It's just the standard sequence. And a lot of the tones are the same because even though we kind of selected a small portion of the quantized part of what the quantized knob actually does, there's still like multiples of the quantize which makes the same sound. You can imagine if we make the cell twice as wide, that the modulation is going to sound somewhat similar. And in fact you can hear that if I just play it normally, in the fact that we have these repeating sounds that tonally speaking sound very much alike. So this octave bump just helps prevent that by actually taking those tones and playing them at different octaves randomly. Also, if you're lucky, like we were at the end, you get some nice arps out of it as well. So that's everything that I wanted to talk about in this video. If you enjoy these kinds of videos where I just make a synth and explain it to you and maybe show some interesting sound design properties, then let me know by leaving a like. If you're new here and you want to see more of my stuff, then obviously subscribe. You can also turn on the bell notifications to get notified by YouTube whenever I upload something. Finally, if you want to support the channel, there's several ways of doing that. First of all, you can support me by listening to my music, or you can donate or sign up to my Patreon to support me monetarily. But that's going to be the video for today. I hope you enjoyed and hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.
How much we allow our past experiences to define us.